Chief Meteorologist Nick Lilly here with another edition of Preparing the Pine Belt. Today we're talking about just where these things come from. Of course, with it being our hurricane season coming up, where do we look for the development of tropical systems? Well, for June, we look pretty close to home here in the Gulf of Mexico, down into the northwest Caribbean, and then just off the Atlantic coast, the east coast. And I got to tell you, there's a little bullseye in here because generally we look so close to home because we have cold fronts that are still trying to get through here, and we end up with little pieces of energy that get kind of cut off from the main flow. They end up kind of drifting around in the Gulf, and that's why you see a little bullseye here. And generally, the arrows pointing the direction that any of these storms, these systems, these potential tropical cyclones, as they're sometimes called, end up going. Well, in July, we actually stretch this well back off to the west. We get down into the Caribbean, out into the open Atlantic, sort of, not too far out there. But again, we're still talking about just off the east coast and down into the Gulf of Mexico. Once we get into August, then we really start to open the door out into the open Atlantic. Not quite all the way to the coast of Africa, but you do end up with the darker shades of orange in here, and then a shade of red where you really look for the development of tropical system. The arrows pointing the direction that these storms tend to take, either keeping them out to sea and into the Atlantic, or taking them generally into the Gulf of Mexico and a little bit closer to us. As we get out into September, notice how far this pushes all the way across the open Atlantic and off the coast of Africa. And they'll develop out here and track all the way across the Atlantic, and they can drift into the Gulf of Mexico. They can turn and stay out to sea, like some of the stronger hurricanes tend to do. As they strengthen, they tend to go poleward a little bit faster. Or they can stay off to the south and just kind of drift this direction. You remember Harvey from last year stayed a little more disorganized as it did so, but just kind of drifted along that southern track and then went right into the Gulf of Mexico and unfortunately made a beeline right for Houston. As we move through October, the area of development tends to get a little bit closer to home again. We're starting to talk about off the east coast, mainly out into the Atlantic a little further, not necessarily hugging the coastline, down toward Cuba, into the Caribbean, and still into the Gulf of Mexico. And as we close out hurricane season in November, then we start to look back just in the Gulf of Mexico, just off the east coast, and then down into the northern Caribbean. And that's it for this edition of Preparing the Pine Belt.